Imagine standing on a balcony in Cebu, salt air rolling in off the water, motorbike is humming somewhere below, and realizing that the tightness in your chest, the one you carried for 26 years in uniform and another 12 after that, has finally let go. I'm 74 years old. My name is John Miller, and until 3 years ago, if you'd told me I would end my life on a tropical island 8,000 miles from Texas, I would have laughed you out of the room. I served 26 years in the United States Army. I buried my wife of 45 years. And at an age when most men are just trying to make it through another quiet afternoon, I found something I didn't even know I was looking for. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and let us know in the comments which country you're watching from. I was born in San Antonio, Texas, in 1952, the second of 4 boys in a family that didn't talk much about feelings but showed love through discipline, through work, through showing up. My father drove a delivery truck for a bakery. My mother kept the books for a hardware store 2 blocks from our house. We weren't poor, but we understood the value of a dollar the way people do when they've watched their parents stretch every one of them. I enlisted in the United States Army in 1971, right out of high school, at 19 years old. I won't pretend it was some grand patriotic calling, though that came later. At the time, it was a way out, a way to see something bigger than the block I grew up on, a way to have 3 meals a day and a paycheck without asking my father for anything. I didn't know yet that the Army would become the architecture of my entire adult life. Basic training broke me down the way it's designed to. I remember a drill sergeant named Kowalski who could reduce a 19-year-old to tears with 4 words. And I remember the strange, unexpected pride I felt the day I realized I could take whatever he threw at me and still stand up straight the next morning. That's when I understood something about myself that would define the next 26 years. I didn't quit. Whatever else people wanted to say about John Miller, they couldn't say he quit. I was deployed to Vietnam in 1972, in the later stages of the American involvement, attached to a logistics unit responsible for keeping supply lines moving in and out of contested areas. I was young. I was scared in ways I didn't have words for at the time, and only found words for decades later, sitting in a VA counselor's office at 58 years old, finally admitting that some nights I still heard the sound of transport trucks grinding through mud in my sleep. I lost friends over there. I won't list their names because some things belong only to the men who lived them, but I carry every one of those names still, the way you carry stones in your pocket. Not painful exactly anymore, just present, just wait. When I came home in 1973, the country wasn't kind to soldiers returning from that particular war. I remember being told more than once that I should change out of my uniform before going into certain restaurants. I remember the specific loneliness of coming back from something enormous and finding that nobody wanted to hear about it. So I did what a lot of us did. I went quiet. I stayed in the Army because the Army, whatever its faults, never asked me to explain myself. It just asked me to show up and do the job. And I did. For 26 years I did. I moved through the ranks the slow, steady way. Not through brilliance, but through reliability, which I've come to believe is a much rarer and more valuable trait than people give it credit for. I became a non-commissioned officer, then worked my way up through the NCO ranks until I made first sergeant, a position I held for the better part of a decade before I retired. Being a first sergeant means you are the backbone of a company, not the officer giving orders from above, but the man in the middle, responsible for the welfare, discipline, and readiness of every soldier under your watch. Young men and women would come to me with problems they couldn't tell their commanding officer, money troubles, marriage troubles, fear they'd never admit to anyone else. And it was my job to fix what could be fixed and to know when to send them somewhere else for help. I was stationed at Fort Sam Houston, at Fort Hood, at Fort Bragg, and for 2 years, at a base in Germany that I still think about on quiet mornings. I met my wife, Linda, at a USO dance in 1974, not long after I came home from Vietnam. She was a nurse working at the base hospital, sharp-tongued and completely unimpressed by my uniform, which is exactly why I fell for her. We married in 1975. Over the following decades, she followed me from post to post, raised our two children largely on her own during my deployments and training rotations, and never once, not one single time in 45 years, made me feel guilty for the life the Army required of us both. I retired from the United States Army in 1997 at 45 years old, with the rank of First Sergeant and a chest full of things I still can't talk about easily. I remember standing at my retirement ceremony, looking out at the small crowd of family and fellow soldiers, and feeling an emotion I didn't have a name for, something between pride and grief, like watching a part of your own identity get folded up and put away in a box. Retirement from the Army isn't really retirement, not at 45. You still have decades of work ahead of you, a mortgage, children not yet through college, a pension that helps but doesn't carry a family on its own. So I did what a lot of retired NCOs do. I found a second career. I went to work for an industrial equipment company outside San Antonio, first as a maintenance technician and eventually as a maintenance supervisor overseeing a crew of 18 men. 12 years I gave to that job. It wasn't the Army. Nothing ever quite replaces the Army. But it had its own rhythms, its own sense of purpose, its own version of the discipline I'd built my whole life around. Linda and I bought a modest house in a quiet neighborhood on the north side of San Antonio in 2001. We raised our son and daughter there. We watched them grow, marry, move away. Our son to Colorado for a job in engineering. Our daughter to North Carolina, married to a man in the Air Force. Funny how these things circle back. We became grandparents. We took a cruise for our 40th anniversary. We thought, and I say this without any irony, because it's exactly what we believed, that we had built a good, solid American life, and that we would grow old together in that house, on that quiet street, surrounded by the life we'd made. I retired fully from the maintenance company in 2009 at 57, and Linda and I settled into what I can only describe as a genuinely happy decade. Mornings with coffee on the back porch, fishing trips, a vegetable garden that Linda tended like it was her third child. Sunday calls with the grandkids. It was, by any reasonable measure, everything a man could ask his life to be after everything that had come before it. Then, in the spring of 2021, Linda was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. I'm not going to spend a long time on this part, not because it doesn't matter, it matters more than anything else in this story, but because some pain doesn't need elaboration to be understood. If you've lost someone after decades together, you already know. If you haven't, no amount of description from me will get you there, and I'd rather not try to manufacture something that should stay sacred. She fought for 8 months. I was with her every day of it, the way you'd expect a man who spent 26 years being told never to leave anyone behind to be with the person who mattered more to him than anyone else on earth. She died in November of 2021, at home, in the bed we'd shared for over 4 decades, with our children on a video call because the pandemic still made travel complicated, and with my hand in hers. I was 69 years old, and for the first time since I was 19, I had absolutely no idea what I was supposed to do next. The Army teaches you how to survive almost anything except this. There's no training exercise for the specific silence of a house built for 2 people that now holds only 1. I'd wake up at 5 a.m. out of 45 years of habit, roll over to say something to Linda, and remember, every single morning, in that first half second before memory caught up with reality, that she was gone. I'd make 2 cups of coffee before I caught myself. I'd set 2 plates. Grief, I learned, isn't really an emotion. It's a series of small administrative corrections you have to make to your own body clock, over and over, for longer than anyone tells you it'll take. My children were wonderful, in the way children are wonderful when they're trying very hard and living 1,000 miles away. My daughter called every Sunday. My son flew in twice that first year. But they had their own lives, their own children, their own careers, their own griefs to carry, because Linda was their mother too, and I sometimes forgot, in my own pain, that I wasn't the only one who'd lost her. The house, which had felt like a sanctuary for 20 years, started to feel like a museum. Every room held an artifact, The garden Linda had built with her own hands became something I could no longer look at without my throat closing, so I let it go to weeds, which felt like its own kind of betrayal and its own kind of mercy at the same time. And underneath all of it, something more practical was happening, something I was almost embarrassed to be thinking about while I was supposedly in mourning. The math of my life had changed, and not in my favor. Here's something they don't tell you in the recruiting office, and something the VA doesn't put on a pamphlet. A military pension and Social Security, which felt like more than enough for two people living carefully in a paid-off house, suddenly feel very different when you're the only one drawing breath in that house. And when property taxes in Texas have gone up nearly 40% over a decade, and when your health insurance supplement premiums climb every single year, regardless of what your income does. I want to be precise about this because I think precision matters more than complaining. My military retirement pay, combined with Social Security, gave me an income that most people would call comfortable. I wasn't poor. I want to say that clearly, because I don't want anyone watching this who's struggling far worse than I was to feel like I'm exaggerating a hardship I didn't fully have. But comfortable and secure are two very different things. And what I felt in the 2 years after Linda died was the slow erosion of security. Property taxes on our home in San Antonio had climbed to a point where they alone consumed a significant chunk of my monthly income. Homeowners insurance, after a string of hailstorms hit Central Texas, had more than doubled. My health insurance, even with my TRICARE for Life supplement covering a great deal, still left me with out-of-pocket costs for the ordinary indignities of being 70 years old. A hip that ached in cold weather, blood pressure medication, a cardiologist visit twice a year that always seemed to come with some new test I hadn't budgeted for. Groceries, which Linda had always managed to stretch further than I ever could, seemed to cost 30% more than they had just a few years earlier. I found myself doing something I never thought I'd do at my age. Sitting at the kitchen table with a legal pad, doing arithmetic on my own life, trying to figure out how many more years the math would work before it didn't. I mentioned some of this once, almost in passing, to my son during one of his visits. He got quiet, and then he said something that stuck with me for a long time. "Dad, you gave the country 26 years and then worked another 12. You shouldn't have to be doing spreadsheets at 70. He wasn't wrong, but knowing he wasn't wrong didn't change the numbers on the legal pad. In early 2023, about a year and a half after Linda passed, I went to a Veterans of Foreign Wars post-meeting, something I'd started doing more regularly, partly for the community, partly because Tuesday nights had become unbearably long and quiet. There was a man there, a retired Air Force Master Sergeant named Ray Delgado, who I'd known casually for years but never particularly well. Ray had been overseas for almost 8 months, and when he came back to visit family, he showed up at the post-meeting looking and I don't know how else to say this, younger, lighter. Like something that had been sitting on his shoulders for a long time had been set down. I asked him where he'd been, expecting him to say Florida, maybe Arizona, one of the usual places retired military go to find warm weather and lower taxes. Instead, he said, Cebu, the Philippines. I'll be honest with you, my first reaction was closer to confusion than curiosity. The Philippines, to me, existed mostly as a name in old service records, a place some of the older men at the post had passed through decades ago during different chapters of American military history. It wasn't on any list of retirement destinations I'd ever considered, not even in the vaguest way. But Ray talked, and I listened, and something in what he said lodged itself in my mind and wouldn't leave. He told me his military pension and Social Security, the same combined income I was drawing, went roughly 3 to 4 times further in the Philippines than it did in Texas. He told me he rented a modern 2-bedroom condominium with air conditioning, a swimming pool, and a security guard downstairs for less than $400 a month, a fraction of what my property taxes alone cost me back home. He told me he ate out most nights, fresh fish and rice and vegetables, for the equivalent of $3 or $4 a meal. He told me his health care, when he'd needed a minor procedure, cost him less out of pocket, without insurance, than his TRICARE supplement copay had cost him for the same procedure back in the States. But it wasn't the numbers that really got to me. It was what he said next. "John," he said, "I haven't felt lonely once since I got there. Not once." I didn't say much to him that night. I went home, sat in my quiet kitchen, and thought about that sentence for a long time. I want to pause the story here because I think this is the part that matters most, more than the tax rates or the cost of chicken adobo or any of the practical details I'll get into later. After Linda died, the hardest part wasn't grief in the abstract sense. It was the specific, grinding loneliness of American retirement as I was living it. My neighborhood, which had been full of families with young children when we moved in, had slowly emptied of the people I once knew. Neighbors moved. Some passed away. The ones who remained kept to themselves in that particular American way, polite waves from the driveway, but rarely a knock on the door, rarely an invitation inside. I'd drive to the grocery store and go days without a real conversation. I'd call my kids and feel the weight of not wanting to burden them with how quiet the house had become. I'd sit in restaurants alone and notice, with a kind of clinical detachment, that I was the only table for one, and that the waitstaff had stopped trying to make conversation with me, because I think my face must have told them not to bother. I want to be careful here, because I'm not saying America failed me, and I'm not interested in blaming a country for a grief that was mine to carry. But I will say this. There is a specific kind of isolation that comes with being an older widower in a country where extended family has scattered across time zones, where communities are built around driving rather than walking, where a stranger striking up a conversation with you at a bus stop is treated as an oddity rather than an ordinary Tuesday. Ray's sentence, "I haven't felt lonely once," hit something in me that the tax numbers never could have touched on their own. I didn't book a flight the next week. I want to be honest about the pace of this, because I think people sometimes tell these stories like a lightning bolt struck and everything changed overnight. And that's not really how it happened, at least not for a cautious old first sergeant like me. What I did was start reading. I joined a couple of online forums for American expats and retirees in the Philippines. I watched interviews, read blog posts, spent a strange number of evenings that spring with a cup of coffee and my laptop, absorbing the details of a life I couldn't yet picture myself living. I read about the difference between Manila, Cebu, Davao, and the smaller island communities. I read about visa requirements, specifically the Special Resident Retirees Visa, which I'll get into in more detail later, because getting these details right matters if any of you watching this are seriously considering a similar move. I read about healthcare quality in the bigger cities, about the cost of hiring household help, about the warmth Filipino culture holds specifically for elders, and specifically, it seemed, for American veterans. I talked to my daughter about it on one of our Sunday calls, tentatively, almost apologetically, like I was confessing to something. I remember her going quiet on the other end of the line, and then saying, "Dad, are you happy right now? Actually happy, not just getting by?" I didn't have a good answer for her. That, more than anything, told me what I needed to know. My son was more skeptical, at least initially. He worried about healthcare access, about safety, about me being far from family if something happened to my health. Those were fair worries, and I want to acknowledge them honestly rather than wave them away, because I had them too. But the more I researched, the more those specific fears started to soften. Cebu, in particular, has several JCI-accredited hospitals with English-speaking staff, many trained in the United States or Australia. The Filipino healthcare system, for all its differences from ours, is not the primitive picture some Americans imagine when they hear Southeast Asia. By the summer of 2023, I had decided on something smaller than a permanent move. I decided to go and see for myself, not to relocate, just to look. I flew into Cebu in September of 2023, 71 years old, alone, more nervous than I'd been about anything since my first deployment, which is a strange thing to admit, but true. 26 years in the Army teaches you to handle physical danger. It doesn't teach you how to handle the vulnerability of starting something entirely new, entirely alone, at an age when most people expect you to have already finished changing. Ray met me at the airport, which I'll always be grateful for. because walking into an unfamiliar country after 20 hours of flights is a lot easier when a familiar face is waiting at arrivals with a sign that says First Sergeant on it, which made me laugh out loud in the middle of a crowded terminal for the first time in longer than I could remember. The first thing that struck me wasn't the heat, though the heat was considerable. It was the warmth of people, not metaphorical warmth, but an actual, specific, repeated experience of strangers treating me with a kind of automatic respect and friendliness that I hadn't felt directed at me in years. The security guard at Ray's condo building called me sir and asked about my flight like he genuinely wanted to know. The woman at the little carinderia down the street remembered my order after the second visit and asked about my children by name after I'd mentioned them once. A tricycle driver spent 20 minutes giving me an impromptu tour of his neighborhood, refusing extra payment simply because he wanted to practice his English and was curious about an old American soldier. I want to be careful not to romanticize an entire country based on 10 days of vacation brain optimism. I know that's a trap, and I'll talk later about the real challenges I found once I actually lived there. But something about the accumulated weight of 100 small interactions, each one small and warm, started to loosen something in my chest that had been tight since November of 2021. I spent time with a community of American and other Western retirees, many of them veterans, at a weekly gathering Ray took me to, an informal group that met at a beachside restaurant every Thursday evening. There were maybe 20 of us that night. I heard stories that echoed mine in different ways. A widower from Ohio, a divorced Air Force veteran from California, a couple from Michigan who'd simply gotten tired of shoveling snow at 70. What struck me was how unashamed everyone seemed to be about needing something different in this last chapter of life, and how little judgment there was in that room for wanting more warmth, more community, more ease, after decades of giving everything to careers and families and obligations. I toured a few properties, not seriously, just to understand the market. I saw a furnished two-bedroom condo with a pool, gym, and 24-hour security for the peso equivalent of roughly $350 a month. I ate meals that cost less than a fast food combo back home and tasted better than most restaurant food I'd had in years. I visited a hospital, out of curiosity more than need, and found clean, modern facilities with staff who spoke fluent English, and took the kind of unhurried time with patients that I hadn't experienced from an American doctor in a decade. On my 8th night there, sitting on a plastic chair outside a small beachfront bar, watching the sun go down over water that color I didn't have a name for, I called my daughter. She asked how the trip was going. I said, I think I might actually do this. There was a long pause, and then she said, Dad, I haven't heard you sound like this in 2 years. I don't want to pretend the decision was easy after that, because it wasn't. I flew home and spent nearly 4 months wrestling with it. I made pro and con lists on the same legal pad I'd used to do my grim little budget calculations. I talked to a financial advisor about how relocating would affect my tax situation, my healthcare coverage, my estate planning. I talked to my kids extensively, wanting their honest concerns, not just their blessing. The fears were real, and I want to name them honestly instead of glossing over them, because I think the people watching this who are considering something similar deserve an honest accounting, not just an inspirational highlight reel. I feared being far from my children and grandchildren if something happened to my health. I feared the disruption of leaving a house I'd shared with Linda for 20 years, worried that leaving would feel like a second betrayal on top of the first. I feared not fitting in, being the awkward old American who never quite understood the culture around him. I feared honestly what people back home would think, whether they'd see it as running away or worse, as somehow forgetting Linda by trying to build something new. That last fear took the longest to work through, and I want to speak to it directly, because I suspect somebody watching this is carrying a version of it right now. Building a new life after loss is not a betrayal of the person you lost. I came to believe, slowly and with real effort, that Linda would not have wanted me sitting in that house, doing arithmetic on a legal pad, growing quieter every year. She was the most practical, most alive person I ever knew. She'd have told me to go, and to go without guilt. In January of 2024, I made the decision. I would sell the house in San Antonio, apply for the Special Resident Retirees Visa, and relocate to Cebu, Philippines. I want to spend some real time here on the mechanics, because I know some of you watching this are less interested in my grief and more interested in whether this is actually achievable for you, and I respect that. Here's what the process actually looked like, stripped of sentiment. Selling the house took about 5 months, from listing to closing, and came with its own emotional weight I won't dwell on again. The proceeds gave me a financial cushion beyond my pension and Social Security, which I invested conservatively rather than spending down, giving myself a buffer for healthcare emergencies and family visits. For residency, I applied for the Special Resident Retirees Visa, commonly called the SRRV, through the Philippine Retirement Authority. For veterans and retirees over 50 with a pension, the required deposit is considerably lower than for younger applicants without a guaranteed monthly income. In my case, a deposit of $10,000 into an approved Philippine bank account, rather than the $20,000 required of those without pension income. The visa process took about 4 months from application to approval, working through a licensed facilitator in Cebu that Ray connected me with, which I'd strongly recommend over trying to navigate the bureaucracy entirely alone. I shipped a modest container of personal belongings, mostly things with sentimental value, photographs, a few pieces of Linda's, some of my Army memorabilia, and sold or donated the rest. Downsizing 45 years of accumulated life into a single shipping container is its own strange, clarifying grief, but also, I found, its own kind of relief. You learn quickly what actually matters when you're forced to choose. I arrived in Cebu permanently in March of 2024, 73 years old, with 2 suitcases, a shipping container 3 weeks behind me, and considerably more courage than I gave myself credit for at the time. I settled into a 2-bedroom condominium in a mid-rise building in the Mandaue Lapu-Lapu area near Cebu City, close enough to the expat and veteran community to have social connection, close enough to local neighborhoods to actually live in the Philippines rather than in some sealed-off foreigner's bubble. My rent, fully furnished, with a pool, gym, and security, runs about $380 a month, compared to property taxes and insurance alone back in Texas that had exceeded $600 a month before I even accounted for the mortgage I'd long since paid off. My total monthly cost of living, including rent, food, utilities, transportation, and healthcare out-of-pocket costs, comes to roughly $1,300 a month, sometimes less. That's for a genuinely comfortable life. Eating out several times a week, hiring a part-time housekeeper twice weekly for about $40 a month total, taking the occasional domestic flight to explore other islands. Back in San Antonio, my monthly expenses, even living frugally, had climbed past $3,000. That gap, the difference between $1,300 and $3,000, isn't just numbers on paper. It's the difference between a legal pad full of anxious arithmetic and a life where I don't check my bank balance with dread anymore. My days now have a rhythm I genuinely enjoy. I wake early, still, out of decades of Army habit, but instead of dread, I feel anticipation. I walk along the waterfront most mornings. There's a stretch near my building where local fishermen bring in their catch, and I've become friendly enough with a few of them that they'll wave me over to see what came in that day. I have coffee at a small local cafe where the owner, a woman named Marites, has started calling me Tatay John. Tatay meaning something like father or dad in Cebuano, a term of affection and respect for older men that still catches in my throat a little every time I hear it. I've become part of a genuine community here, not just the American Veteran Circle, though that matters enormously to me, but Filipino neighbors, shopkeepers, and friends who've folded me into their lives with a generosity I still find remarkable. I was invited to a neighbor's daughter's debut, an 18th birthday celebration that's a significant cultural milestone here, and found myself, an old American soldier, dancing badly and laughing harder than I had in years, surrounded by 3 generations of a family that had known me for less than 6 months. Twice a week, I meet with a group of about 15 fellow American veterans, spanning Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines, at a restaurant overlooking the water. We talk about everything and nothing. Some days it's serious, comparing notes on visa renewals or healthcare providers. And some days it's just old men trading stories and giving each other grief, which I hadn't realized how much I'd missed until I had it again. I promised I wouldn't romanticize this, and I meant it. So let me be straight about the real difficulties, because I think honesty here matters more than a highlight reel. Healthcare, while good in Cebu City proper, is not identical to American healthcare in every respect. Specialist availability for very rare conditions can require travel to Manila. I keep my TRICARE for life coverage, and while it doesn't cover much locally, it does cover care if I need to fly back to the United States for something complex, which gives me a safety net I'm grateful to have. I've had 2 minor procedures done locally, a cataract surgery and a dental implant, both at a fraction of American cost, both with quality I'd rate as fully comparable to what I received back home. The heat and humidity took real adjustment. My first few months, I underestimated how much a Texas summer differs from a tropical climate that doesn't really have an off-season. I had to relearn my own body's limits, drink more water than I thought necessary, and give myself grace on days when the heat simply won. Bureaucracy here moves at its own pace, and patience, a virtue the Army did actually teach me, thankfully, is essential. Visa renewals, banking, utility setup, all require a kind of relaxed persistence that would frustrate someone expecting American efficiency. And I won't pretend the distance from my children and grandchildren doesn't ache. I miss birthdays in person. I miss the specific chaos of a holiday dinner table crowded with family. I've made peace with video calls and annual visits, both directions, since my son and daughter have each come to see me here, and both, notably, left saying they understood the decision far better after seeing it than they had from 4,000 miles away. Safety, a concern many people raise, has not been an issue for me personally. Cebu City has its areas to avoid like any city does, and ordinary street sense applies here the same as anywhere. I've felt, if anything, safer walking at night in my neighborhood than I did in parts of San Antonio in my final years there. I want to close this out by being honest about what changed, because I think that's the part that matters most, more than the cost of living spreadsheet or the visa paperwork. I am 74 years old, and for the first time since November of 2021, I wake up most mornings without dread. I have a community that checks on me, that expects me at the cafe, that notices if I miss a Thursday dinner with the other veterans. I have found, unexpectedly, a version of the camaraderie I thought I'd left behind when I retired from the Army. Not the same. Nothing replaces 26 years of that particular bond, but something adjacent to it, something built on shared history and mutual care between men who understand, without needing to explain, what it costs to give decades of your life to something larger than yourself. I think about Linda every single day, and I don't think that will ever stop, nor would I want it to. But I no longer feel like I'm simply waiting out the remaining years in a house full of memory. I feel, instead, like I'm living something new, built on top of everything that came before, rather than instead of it. If you'd told the 19-year-old version of me, standing in that basic training barracks in 1971, that he'd end up here, retired, widowed, 74 years old, living on an island in the Philippines, greeted by name at a local cafe, dancing at a neighbor's daughter's debut, I don't think he'd have believed a word of it, but here I am. And I can tell you, with the same certainty I once felt raising my right hand to serve this country, that leaving Texas for the Philippines has been the best decision I've made since the day I left the United States Army.